We begin today's shiur 5 lines from the top of Daf Mem Vov, in the middle of the line, Mosiv. At the side of the Gemara text, you'll notice the beginning of a long question marking. But before we begin the Gemara, let us simply point out that we're in the middle of a discussion. On the side of the Gemara, we have a Tat Nosei reference, Hektish Chometz V'Shichur Mafkir Midei Shibud. We emphasize the word Shichur, the slave who is set free, so that even though he might have been set up as a source of collateral, source of collection of debts, but once he is set free, so that undoes that particular arrangement. This was a halacha that was mentioned by Rava in the course of the discussion that we saw last time, that began at the bottom of Mem Hey Omid Beis, where we saw a Gentile selling his slave to a Jew. But before the Jew took possession of the slave immersed in a mikveh with the intention of becoming Jewish. We saw in the Gemara, the ruling was that immersion is effective, and the Jewish purchaser basically loses out. He doesn't get the privilege of owning that slave, because the slave preempted his enslavement to the Jew by jumping into a mikveh with conversion intent. Mosiv Rav Chisda. We continue with the Gemara text. Rav Chisda raises an objection to the ruling we just stated. Maisiv Bluria Hagiores. Bluria is the name of a woman that was converting to Judaism. Now, this woman was, of course, a Gentile, and she also owned slaves. So the story involves this woman, Bluria. Shekidmu avodeha v'tovlu lefaneha. Apparently, the slaves knew what her plans were, so they hastened into a mikveh before she did, for her conversion purposes. So the slaves immersed themselves in the mikveh with the intention of assuming Judaism. And the Chachamim rule that they acquire themselves, they become their own owners as free Jewish people. And now the Gemara infers, this whole story is effective because they did so before she became Jewish. But if she became Jewish before them, before they're jumping into the mikveh, we wouldn't say that the Eved acquires himself as a Ben Chorin. Contrary to the pshat, the ruling that we saw in the name of Rav, who said the bottom line of Omid Beis, of Mem Hamid Beis, Kono Atzmo Ben Chorin. Here we're seeing that if she became Jewish before them, they wouldn't have acquired their own freedom. The Gemara answers, Amar Rava, Lefaneha, Bein Bistam, Bein B'Mefurash. There are two situations. There's if they do their immersion before she does, so then it makes no difference whether they explained why they were immersing themselves in the mikveh. Even if they remained silent about it, they didn't explain, they didn't say explicitly why they were immersing, their immersion would be effective. That's as far as if they did so before she. La'achareha. If, however, she immersed for conversion purposes first, then we say b'mefurash in, b'stam lo. Only if they immerse themselves with the explicit declaration that they are doing so for conversion purposes, then it would be effective. So that with this we're able to preserve the psak of Rav from the bottom of Amud Aleph, of Mem Hamid Beis. Take note of the fact we have a long point now. Amar of Avia, lo shanu ela belokeach mino oivei kechavim. This halacha is true only when you're dealing with a purchase from a Gentile. Aval oivei kechavim gufei a Gentile who sold himself to a Jew, koni, that is effective, that works. And the result being that the Jew acquires this Gentile to be a slave. Now Rashi says, just a couple lines down from here, a Gentile that sold himself to a Jew, koneu Yisrael legufei, the Jew acquires him fully. In other words, he gains an inherent ownership of him. Not just a financial obligation, a work obligation, but he gains a full inherent ownership. And if this Gentile who sold himself to a Jew would attempt this mikveh immersion, let's say trick, it won't work. We continue in the Gemara. Dichtiv, the Pasuk says, "V'gam mibnei hatoshavim hagorim imochem mehem tiknu." The Pasuk describes the Jewish people upon their entrance to the land of Israel. So it says that from the local inhabitants, the Gentile peoples that were in the land, you, the Jewish people, can acquire them. And we learn from here several points. Number one, atem koinim mehem, you, the Jew, can acquire them. Veloheim koinim mikem, and they don't acquire you. That's a point that will be discussed momentarily in the Gemara. Veloheim koinim zeh mizeh, nor do they acquire one another. The Gemara now focuses on point 2. Veloheim koinim mikem. The halacha said, based on the pasuk, that they do not acquire from you. In other words, the pasuk says you acquire them, leaving room to infer that they do not acquire you, that the Gentiles do not acquire a Jew as a slave. Well, you say lemai. Regarding what do you say they do not acquire? If you were to think that a Gentile cannot acquire a Jew for his work, for his work production, for his obligation to serve in a work capacity, that's not true to say that a goy cannot acquire a Jew with that in mind. Is it so that a goy cannot acquire a Jew for his work, for his maisi yadav? In other words, that through the goy paying the Jew we'll say enslave himself for work purposes, does that not take hold? It certainly does. The pasuk says regarding a Jew that was sold, it says O le'eker mishpachas ger. That's a quote from the pasuk, the Omar Mar, and the explanation of mishpachas ger is zeh ha'oivei kechavim, that the Jew is sold le'eker mishpachas ger. That means you're sold to a Gentile. So the Torah itself acknowledges that a Jew can become duty bound, work bound to a Gentile owner. Elolav legufei. When we say that a Gentile cannot acquire a Jew, that means this higher level of ownership called legufei, an inherent ownership. In literally to own his body. Doesn't become an owner of his body, it doesn't become a piece of property of the Gentile, but rather a work obligation does develop if the Jew was sold to a goy. So the drasha before we said before 3 points. Atem koinim mehem ve'lo hein koinim mikem ve'lo hein koinim zeh mizeh. So we know that when in point number 2, when it said v'lo hein koinim mikem, it meant they don't acquire a kinyan goof on the Jew. The ka'amar rachmana atem koinim mehem, and the Torah does say in the same breath that you do acquire them, which means in the same level, afilu ligufei. So that this is the end of the point. The point being that a Gentile that sells himself to a Jew, he becomes the full property of the Jew. And with that in mind, as we saw before in the Rashi, that if he were to try to immerse himself in the mikveh to become free, he can't do that because the Jew who bought him owns him bodily as well, and that prevents the mikveh trick that we saw before. So just to restate that, we saw that if a Gentile was selling a slave to a Jew, since the Gentile didn't have a kinyan goof on the Eved, that left room for the Eved before being taken over by the Jew. Left room during that switchover period for the Eved, for the slave to immerse himself in mikveh, and as we saw before, to mafkia midei shibu, to undo any further work obligations, because that is all that the Gentile had sold to the Jew when selling this slave, and that can be undone by shifur, by immersing in the mikveh. Porach Rav Acha. Rav Acha raises an objection or a question. He says, Emo bekaspa ubetvila. Rashi, Emo bekaspa ubetvila l'shum avdus hu deka'amar rachmona likni. Maybe when the Torah says that atem konim mikem, that's only when you buy them through a payment of money, that's kaspa. Ubetvila means immersion in the mikveh with intention to be a slave. That's when the Torah says you acquire them. Aval im kidam v'tova l'shem ben chorin, hachi nami de ben chorin hu. But if he were to hasten before the Jew takes full ownership of him, it would work. So that when the Torah says atem koinim mehem, all it means is that the possibility to acquire them exists through paying for the slave, or paying him, and immersion for enslavement. But if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't immerse for the purpose of enslavement, but money was merely paid, let's say to the Jew paid a Gentile in anticipation of owning him, but before he started working for the Jew, that same Gentile immersed himself in a mikveh l'shem ben chorin for the purpose of becoming Jewish, that would work. So that to say so conclusively, as Rav Avio said, that a Gentile who sells himself to a Jew at the point that the sale takes place, he can no longer immerse himself for the purpose of being a Jew, that is not necessarily so. Kashya, and the Gemara leaves this point over as a difficulty. It's a question, a difficulty against or on Rav Avya's ruling. Omar Shmuel, v'tzorach l'tokfoi b'mayim. Rashi explains that in order for the Jew to acquire the slave, and that the slave should work for him, Rashi says, l'tokfo b'mayim kishemat bilo l'shem yadus la'avdus, when you are buying a Gentile for the purpose of working for you, so there's an immersion that takes place for the sake of a form of Judaism under the context of enslavement. Sarach she'it kefenu loseis olav oil melacha b'mayim. You have to put upon him the yoke of work while he's still in the water. Kedei shetei mires ketvilas avdus. If you put upon him some type of burden on him while he's in the water, so it appears that he is immersing as a slave. Shafilu yomahu l'shem ben chorin. At that point, that if he says that he's immersing for the sake of becoming free, for the sake of becoming a Jew, lo kona atzmo ben chorin v'lo yehei mamoshes b'dvar. He won't acquire himself to be a free Jewish person, because the facts that you see that he's with a burden upon him will contradict that. It demonstrates that he really is a slave. Kiha de Minyamin Avdei de Ravashi, as is illustrated in the following story of Minyamin, the slave of Ravashi. Ba'a le'tebulin, he wanted to immerse him. Rashi says, l'shem yahadus le'evet, to be a slave in the Jewish context. We didn't explain before, but in terms of categories of humanity, so you have Gentiles, you have Jews, and then there's this interim area called Avdus, where someone immerses himself from having been a straightforward Gentile, immerses himself for the sake of being a slave, but in the context of Judaism, whereby the slave is obligated to fulfill mitzvos similar to the mitzvahs that a Jewish woman is obligated to fulfill. It's a special category. So you have here, Rav Ashi was acquiring Minyamin, and he wanted to acquire him as a slave within the Jewish context. Masrei nihalayhu l'Ravino u'l'Rav Acha brei d'Rava. Rav Ashi gave Minyamin over to the charge of Ravino and Rav Acha. Amar lahu, and Rav Ashi said to them, Chazu deminaychu kavo'ina lei. Take note, or be careful, that I am going to seek him from you. Meaning that if he were to immerse himself and declare himself a ben choren, so I'm going to ask you to compensate me for the loss. So that Rav Ashi was paying money for Minyamin to be his slave. And in order to become a slave, so there is an immersion in the mikveh that is necessary, as we explained before. And Rav Ashi is charging Ravino and Rav Acha to take care of the matter. And he's adding that be careful that if there's some type of mess up here where Minyamin declares his immersion l'shem ben chorin, to be a free man, to become Jewish, then I'm going to ask you to compensate me for the loss of the money that I paid for him. Ramu lei aruyasa b'tzaporei. So they put a chain, aruyasa, around his neck. Arpule v'tzimtzulule. It says it was loosened and it was tightened. Arpule kihechi delo leheve chatzitza. When immersing in the mikveh with a chain around you, it has to be a loose fit so that the water touches all parts of your body and that the chain doesn't present an interposition. Tzimtzumule, and then as he rose out of the water, they tightened it. Kihechi delo liktim v'leimo l'shem ben chorin ani tovel. It seems to be some type of momentary strangulation, if you will, whereby he won't be able to talk because the chain is tightened and preventing him from declaring at that point that his immersion was for the sake of conversion to be a free Jewish man. Bahadi the doli reishimi maya, as he was lifting his head out of the water, anchule zulta detino areshe. They placed a vessel full of cement on his head. The omru lay, and they said, Zil amti lebei morach. Go take this to your master's house. So as you can see, this is an illustration of the points that we learned before, that a slave that is being acquired by a Jewish owner, one has to make sure that when the immersion takes place, there's no chance of his declaring that it's an immersion for freedom, and it has to appear that he is immediately working in servitude, so that we can see that it was a tvila l'shem abdus, and if he were to declare at any subsequent point that he immersed himself as an immersion of a free man, someone who's converting to be a full-fledged Jew, we would say that's a joke. We saw you serving as a slave. In this case, carrying this vessel around with tina or tit on his head. The Gemara continues. Omar lei Rav Papa l'Rava. You can see we have a slash mark indicating that this is a new point of thought. Rav Papa says to Rava, Chazi Mor Hani Debei Papa Bar Abba. Take note. Do you see these members of the house of Papa Bar Abba? The Avi Zuzi L'Inshi L'Kargayu, where they pay money to the king's officials, the king's tax collectors. Kargayu is a head tax. Umishabdi Bahu, and after paying the head tax for specific people in the community, they then take those people and then enslave them. In other words, by paying their tax, these Gentiles for whom they paid the tax become the slaves of the people of Bei Popi Bar Abba. Ki nachki, when they leave their servitude, srichi gita decherusa olo. Do they need a get shichrur? A get shichrur is a document. Gita is a document. Cherusa, freedom. A get shichrur is characteristic of a slave that's owned by a Jew, and if he should decide to free him, he frees him by giving him this document of release, and by receiving this document of release, the slave becomes a full-fledged Jew. So the question is this means of acquisition, the tax payment for people who are delinquent in their taxes, and the subsequent enslavement, does that result in their being full-fledged slaves? Characteristic of which is the need for a get shichrur, get to the cherusa, in the event that they are going to be released from their bondage. Omar lei, so Rava says back to Rav Papa, Ichu shachivi, if I would have died, lo amri l'chu ha-milsa, I wouldn't have told you the following. In other words, you're lucky that I'm around to tell you, to answer your question. Hachi Amar Rav Sheshes, thusly says Rav Sheshes, regarding this whole arrangement of paying the taxes for the tax delinquent, Rav Sheshes explains, Muharkaihu dahani betafsa de malka monach. The word muharkaihu, Rashi says chosamon shelelu. Chosamon is literally their seal, their we can say their papers, their documents. People have documents, and their documents lie in the king's treasury. So that maybe we can understand this in the sense that every citizen has his papers that are in the king's possession. Umalka Omar, and the king declares. We should point out also there's a Rashi that says, "V'tafsa demalka shahoyu lo lavodim." The people that became slaves to the king, those people have papers that lie in the king's treasury, and the king says there's a national rule. Malka Omar, the king declares, "Man de lo yoyev karga," one who does not pay his head tax. In other words, one who is a tax delinquent, mishtabed leman de yoyev karga, is to be enslaved to he who does pay their tax. What this means for us is that they become full-fledged slaves, and becoming a slave to a Jew means that if one day the slave is going to be released, he can't be released other than through a get shichrur, the special document that frees him. And as we said before, the result of that would be the person becomes a full-fledged Jew. As we go on in the Gemara, we have first of all a topic heading on the side under the nosei topic heading. We've written Shloisha Dvorim Shira Rabbi Chia Bar Abba Bekilas Gavla. There are three three events, three incidents that Reb Chia witnessed in the community of Gavla. And we also have a long marking that indicates the length of this particular section. We call it on the side of the Gemara text, Maisa de Gavla, the incident in Gavla. Reb Chia, the Gemara, Reb Chia, Bar Abba Ikla LeGavla, Reb Chia visited Gavla. And you can see we have a double underline highlighting the incidents, the points that he saw. Number one, Choza v'nois Yisrael de ma'abron mi geirim shemolu v'lo tavlu. He saw that there were Jewish women that had been impregnated by men that converted from their Gentile status through having circumcised, but not immersed in a mikveh. V'chaza chamro di Yisrael de maski oivdei kechavim b'shas Yisrael, and he noticed chamra is wine of Jews, Jewish wine that idol worshippers were pouring, and Jews were drinking from it. V'chaza turmusin de shalki oivdei kechav v'achli Yisrael, and Rav Chia saw that there were turmus. Turmus is a type of vegetation that needs extensive cooking before it becomes edible. And he saw that Gentiles were cooking the turmusim and Jews were eating from them, bearing in mind that there is a halacha that restricts Jews from eating food cooked by non-Jews. So in this case they were eating turmusim that were cooked by non-Jews. V'lo omar lahu v'lo midi. And Rav Chia did not say anything to them. Also l'kamid Rav Yochanan, he came before Rav Yochanan Amar Lei, and Rav Yochanan said to Rav Chia bar Abba, say v'hachreis, you have to go and announce, declare al b'neim shem mamzerim, that their children are mamzerim. Their children are illegitimate. These are the Jewish girls that were impregnated by converts that only went through the circumcision process and not immersion. The al yenom mishum yayin nesech, and declare their wine to be unfit for Jewish consumption. There's a Rashi val yenom mishum yayin nesech. Rashi on the first line under the Gemara, the afagav de lo nagi elokocho bi'amahu osir mishum lech amrin l'nezira. Even though the Gentiles did not actually touch the wine, a Gentile who touches and stirs the wine itself would render it unfit, which we call yayin nesech. In this case, they didn't actually touch the wine itself, but rather they caused the wine to move by holding the receptacle in which the wine wasn't pouring out the wine. But nevertheless, even though it's not an actual physical contact between the wine and the Gentile himself, we nevertheless forbid it in order to create a fence, a distancing from the actual prohibition, which we just described, is where the Gentile directly touches the wine, rendering it unfit, as part of the various dietary laws that apply to the Jewish people. And the third point that he was to announce is V'al turmusan mishum bishulei oivdei kechavim, and regarding their turmuses, they're forbidden because they are cooked by Gentiles. Lefi she'eino b'nei Torah. And the Rashi points out that the Lefi she'eino Torah is a follow-up of their turmusin. That we'll see later in the Gemara that technically speaking, because of the rules of Bishulei Ovdei Kechavim, the rules that govern food cooked up by Gentiles, the Turmusin really weren't Bishulei Ovdei Kechavim, as the Gemara will explain later, but nevertheless, even though they weren't really forbidden on the grounds of being cooked by Gentiles for reasons that the Gemara will spell out later, nevertheless, they are ruled to be unfit because the people of that community were not Torah knowledgeable. They were not B'nai Torah. Now the Gemara goes over these points. Number one, corresponding to the one before, Al B'neihem Shei Mamzerim, the idea that their children are considered Mamzerim, Rabbi Yochanan Tamei. This is Rabbi Yochanan, consistent with what he has said elsewhere. The Omar Reb Chia bar Abba Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Note, this is a point that lasts a couple of lines. Reb Chia, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, says, "The olam ein ger ad shimol v'yitbol." A person does not become a convert, does not become a Jew through conversion until he is circumcised and immerses. The keva dolotovil, and since there in Gavla the described converts did not do the immersion, oived kochavim hu, he's still considered a full-fledged Gentile. The Amar Rabba Barbachana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Again, we dashed on Rabbi Yochanan to show that in order to come to the conclusion that the children are mamzer, we combine these 2 points of law. And the second point is oived kichav ve'eved abo avas Yisrael, an idol worshipper or a slave, or a Gentile or a slave that has intimacy or impregnates a Jewish girl, havlad mamzer. So that's the point. We said we have a long point. That's the point to show how Rav Yochanan here is, by declaring those children mamzerim, that he's consistent with what he said elsewhere in these two regarding these 2 points. Number 2, v'al yenom mishum yayin nesach. Rabbi Yochanan expected a declaration to be made concerning their wine as it being considered forbidden wine, mishum, and as we saw before in the Rashi, even though the real yayin nesach, the real forbidden wine, was not created here because the Gentiles did not touch the wine; they simply poured the wine. Nevertheless, we declare it Osir, forbidden, mishum, because of this principle. It's a phrase, but it's a principle which means we create distance. The phrase is lech lech amrin nazira schor schor lekarma lo tikra. We'll translate it. Means we declare to the nazir. The nazir is one who accepted upon himself through a vow not to benefit from the products of grapevines. So we tell the nazir, if he has to get from place A to place B, and maybe there'd be a shortcut by cutting through a vineyard, the nazir though should go around the vineyard. Don't get near the vineyard itself. That's too much of a temptation. For our purposes, it means keep distance. So the Gentile that didn't actually touch the wine, but was pouring it, that's too close for comfort. He might end up touching it, making it real yayin nesech. So that even though he's not actually touching it, we still declare the wine forbidden, so that people will know to stay away from wine that the Gentiles handle. And the third point, v'al turmuson mishum bishulei oivdei kechavim lefi she'enon b'nei Torah. Their turmusin were declared forbidden based on the principle or the rule of bishulei of means food cooked by Gentiles is unfit, is prohibited for a Jew to consume. And the ruling was thus because they were not diligent in their Torah observance. Ha b'nei Torah, sorry, are we to infer from this that if they were b'nei Torah, if the Gavla community was comprised of Torah studious individuals, we would allow them to eat the tormusin cooked up by Gentiles? V'amar Rav Shmuel bar Abba, v'amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, mishmei the Rav. Note that we have Rav's name in a house marking on the side. We indicate Shnei Lishonos Barav, the Mawa Koivel Shel Bishul Nochri. Two different versions of Rav, of what establishes something as being Bishul Nochri. One version is Eino Ne'echal Chai. It's something that you would not be able to eat raw. If, let us say, a Gentile cooked up an apple, that wouldn't be a problem because an apple is something that one can eat raw. A turmus is something that you cannot eat raw. A second opinion as to what makes something, what qualifies something as, or what disqualifies something as bishul nachri, it's something that's oila al shulchan malachim. If it's a type of food that would be served amongst dignitaries, like served to kings and other important officials, that would make it, that would be grounds for declaring something when cooked up by a Gentile as bishul nachri. However, let us say it's a food item that kings don't eat. I don't know of a practical example, but Can you imagine a king eating popcorn? If that's something that you couldn't imagine, so then if a Gentile would prepare popcorn based on this idea that it's something that's eino oila al shulchan malachim, it wouldn't become bishul nochri. Bishul nochri is only that food item that, when cooked by a Gentile, would be something you would serve to a king. So we're dealing right now with the Turmusin. They're considered bishul nachri only because there the people were not Torah diligent, leaving you room to think that if they were Torah diligent individuals and a goy happened to cook up, the Gentile happened to cook up a turmus, you'd be allowed to eat it. But is that really so? But wasn't it said in the name of Rav, Kol hanechal kamoishu chai, ahin bo mishum bishulei odekachavim. Items, food items that you could eat raw. Chai means raw. So then if it's cooked up, it wouldn't be rendered forbidden on the grounds of bishul nochri. The turmus einoi nechal kamoshul chai v'yesh bo mishum bishulei odekachavim. The turmus, though, is a type of vegetation that cannot be eaten raw. It's a type of vegetation that must be cooked before it becomes edible. And if that's the case, it is real bishul nochri by a Gentile cooking up that would render it forbidden, regardless of whether they're B'nai Torah or not. Even if they are B'nai Torah over there, it's something that would not be allowed to be eaten. The turmus cooked up by a Gentile. So why does Rabbi Yochanan before give us the impression that really it's not a problem, other than the fact that they're not B'nai Torah? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan ki'idoch lishnos virale. Rabbi Yochanan holds, in terms of what defines something as bishul nochri, like the other version of Rav. The Amr of Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Mishmei de Rav, Kol she'ein oila al shulchan melachim le'echol boy es apas. Anything that would not be served on the table of kings, that would accompany his meal that he eats with bread, ein bo mishul bishulei of the kochavim. Such an item, if cooked up by a Gentile, would not be forbidden. The emphasis must be that the turmus is a type of food item that you wouldn't serve dignitaries. So that why was it declared? Why did Rabbi Yochanan want to declare the turmusin in Gavla Aser? The taimot the eino b'nei Torah. The only reason there he wanted to be strict upon them was because they were not Torah diligent. B'nei Torah shari, had they however been Torah diligent individuals, then he wouldn't have imposed this restriction, because Rabbi Yochanan, as far as letter of the law is concerned, the turmus is something that's not oila al shulchan malachim. Hence, if it's cooked up by a Gentile, it doesn't make it into real bishulei nochri. It doesn't make it into real food stuff cooked up by Gentile. In other words, it doesn't make it into the real forbidden bishulei nochri. Continuing with the Gemara, we glance at the side. We have a topic heading where we've written Gerus. Conversion, Ma dinom shel mol velo toval, toval velo mol. What is the halacha as applies to a Gentile man that converts, circumcises, but doesn't immerse in the mikveh, or the other way, he immerses in a mikveh but doesn't go through circumcision? The Gemara, Tonu Rabbanan, Ger shemol velo toval, a convert who was circumcised but did not immerse in the mikveh. Rabbi Lezer Omer, Harei ze ger. This is considered an acceptable conversion. Shekei motzinu, bavoisenu shemolu velo tovlu. There is precedent in the form of our forebearers in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, the nation of Israel, when they received the Torah. We find that they were circumcised, but there was no immersion. Toval velo mol. What about a case of someone who immersed himself but did not get circumcised? Rabbi Shomer, Harei ze ger. It is an effective gerus. In other words, immersion alone is effective. Shekei motzinu b'mois shetablu velo molu. We find by the wives, the women folk, at the time of the receipt of the Torah, that women pretty much obviously don't circumcise, but they did immerse themselves. So we find that immersion is a sufficient means of entrance into the status of Judaism. We should point out that at the time of the receipt of the Torah, the Jews formally became a Jewish people. And hence we're using that as a precedent for the rules of conversion. V'chachomim oimrim. The Chachamim hold toval v'lo mol, mol v'lo toval, ein ger ad shimol v'yitbol. The Chachamim hold a rule that both elements are necessary for a male to convert to Judaism. The Gemara now asks questions by focusing on the opinions that we've seen till now. V'Rebbe Yeshua nami neilef me'avos, Rebbe Eliezer nami neilef mimois. When we look at Rabbi Eliezer, we saw that circumcision is enough. Why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer say that immersion is enough? And likewise, Rabbi Yeshua, he said that immersion is enough. Why doesn't he say that circumcision is enough? V'chitema. Now, as far as Rabbi Eliezer is concerned, why? The question is, why does Rabbi Eliezer not learn from the Mohis? Why doesn't he learn that immersion is enough? You might say that in reaching halachic conclusions, you don't derive that which is possible from that which is impossible. Now let's translate that into practical terms. Rabbi Eliezer seemingly was not learning like Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua said that immersion is enough. Why would Rabbi Eliezer not learn that immersion is enough? Well, what was the basis for saying immersion is enough? The basis was the women folk at the time of Kabbalah Torah. We saw that they entered the Jewish fold through immersion, without circumcision. Well, of course there's no circumcision by the women folk because it's an impossibility. So you might say that you can't learn from the women folk to the men folk, where there is a possibility of being circumcised. So you might try to argue like that. Once again, ein donin efshar misha'i efshar. Well, that's not true for Hatanya. We have the following Tanaic source where we see precedent for donning, for concluding the possible from the impossible. V'hatanya. And it's worth noting that we're going to focus on Rebbe Eliezer right now, because the question that we're asking is focused on Rebbe Eliezer. That, namely, why doesn't Rebbe Eliezer learn from the Imams? So it says here, Rebbe Eliezer Omer, Minayin lepesach doros she'ein bo elo min hachulin. From where do you know that the money that's used to purchase the Korban Pesach sacrifice all through the generations, that it must come from mundane funds, common available funds, and not from money that is labeled as Meiser Sheni funds? Just a word about Meiser Sheni. During the sabbatical cycle, the 7-year agricultural cycle, the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of a person's harvest in the land of Israel, 10% of the produce would be tithed and taken to Jerusalem, and the owner would eat it there. He also has an option from the Torah to redeem the fruits, transfer their sanctity onto money, and take the money and buy food in Yerushalayim. That money is called Demei Meiser Sheni. So Rabbi Eliezer is dealing with the issue that the Korban Pesach cannot come from those monies, but rather from available funds, common, mundane money that you have. So where do we learn this principle from? Ne'emar Pesach b'Mitzrayim v'ne'emar Pesach b'Doros. The Torah speaks about the Korban Pesach that was offered in the land of Egypt, and the Torah speaks about the Korban Pesach that one needs to offer through the generations. Ma Pesach Omor b'Mitzrayim ein bo elo min hachulin. Just like the Pesach that the Torah describes that was offered in the land of Egypt, the first Korban Pesach, it came from mundane funds. Af Pesach Omor l'Doros ein bo elo min hachulin. So too, the permanent Korban Pesach offering that's to be brought generation after generation is also to be brought only from chulin, from mundane non-holy, non-sanctified funds. Amar le Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva addresses Rabbi Eliezer and says, how can you derive your conclusion concerning Pesach Doros, the generational Korban Pesach, from the one-time in history Pesach Mitzrayim event? V'chidonin efshar mishi efshar. Can you don Pesach Doros, which is, it's efshar in Pesach Doros? They were already, let's say that from the time they entered the land of Israel onwards, there was already things like sanctified funds, as in the form of Meiser Sheni. Can you derive the rules of Pesach Doros from Efshar, from the Pesach Mitzrayim, where there was no Meiser Sheni? They were still in the exile of Egypt. There were no tithes necessary. There was no such thing as Meiser Sheni there. So how can you derive Efshar from Efshar? Amar le, so Rabbi Eliezer says back to Rabbi Akiva, Afal Pishi Efshar, even though Pesach Mitzrayim was Efshar, was impossible to have Meiser Sheni money there. Raya Gedola Hi Benilmat Heimena. It nevertheless is a great proof, and it serves as a precedent from which we can learn that Pesach Doros also must come from Chulin funds. Well, that having been said, so too by Gerus, let immersion be enough. Let us learn male conversion from female conversion. Just like by female conversion, immersion was enough, so too by the male conversion, immersion is enough. Even though by the females, circumcision is an impossibility, and by males it is a possibility, but that shouldn't matter. So we see from here that Tevilah, and from Rabbi Eliezer method of reasoning, Tevilah should be enough. Ella, the Gemara continues on Amud Beis. B'toval velo mal. In the case of someone who immersed himself in mikveh without circumcising, Kulei alma lo plihi. Now, Kulei alma, be very careful. Kulei alma usually means everybody. But in this case, Kulei alma is a reference to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Those two opinions will agree to mahani, that it's effective. Ki pligi, the controversy between them comes up regarding only the situation b'mol velo tova, where there was only circumcision without immersion. Rabbi Eliezer, who says that circumcision is enough, Yolif me'avos, he sees that just like the original Jewish people at the time of Kabbalah Torah, the receipt of the Torah, they had only milah, there was no immersion, so too for future generations that is enough. Rabbi Yeshua, who requires immersion, and he will say that circumcision is not enough. Immersion tevilah is necessary. But Avoisnami tevilah have. He feels that there was also immersion with regard to that generation of Jews that received the Torah. Minole, from where does he know that? So you see that with the markings, the Gemara goes through a couple of attempts. The triangles highlight the attempts to show from where does Rabbi Yeshua know that. So, if you're going to say midichtiv, from the fact that the pasuk says lech el ha'am v'kidashtom hayoim u'machor v'chibsu simloisam. Now this pasuk is in the context of the receipt of Torah, and it says that they shall sanctify themselves and they shall wash their clothing, kibsu, or immerse their clothing for the time being. And let's try to see how you would reason from this that there was people immersion. Mind you, in a regular situation of ritual impurity, as is the case of Baal Keri, a man who experiences a semen release, so he becomes ritually impure, becomes Tomei. He is not required to purify his clothing. It's sufficient for him to be Tovel. So in a place where we don't have a kibus requirement, a clothing purification requirement, yet immersion is necessary. Mokum shitol kibus, under situations like we have by Kabbalah Torah, that kibus was necessary, and that we dashed underline 2 lines above, din shitol tvila, all the more so we should require immersion. The Gemara says this is not conclusive, and that's why we began with the word ilema in the triangle. And the Gemara said, if you are to say this, When you see the word ilemo, you know it's not conclusive, and for this reason. The dilma nikius bi'almo. Maybe the kibus begadim, the kibus simloisam, was simply to wash them, they should be clean, and not for purification purposes that would enable us to then make the kal v'chomer. The kal v'chomer we made before was in the context of purification, not in the case of simple cleanliness. So we dismiss that as a source. Elo mehocha, from the following. From where does Rabbi Yeshua know that at the time of Kabbalah Torah there must have been an immersion as well as the circumcision? Vayikach Moshe es hadam vayizroik al ha'om. The pasuk says in the context of Mount Sinai, the receipt of the Torah, that Moshe Rabbeinu took blood and sprinkled it on the people. Ugemiri, and we have a tradition. The ein hazor below tvila. You don't find sprinklings without an accompanying immersion. So the fact that sprinkling took place, that's a sure sign that there had to have been immersion at Maimed Har Sinai. For Rabbi Yeshua, Tavila b'imois minolan, Rabbi Yeshua, who says that you need to have Tavila, and he learned that from the imois, where does he know that from? Where does he know that the women folk immerse themselves? Savorahu, it's a matter of logic. The imkain, if there wasn't even an immersion requirement, through what means would they have entered the heavenly covenant, and in other words, become Jews? Omar Rabbi Chia bar Abo, Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Le'olam eino ger ad sheyitmol v'yitbol. So Rabbi Chia is reflecting the opinion of the Chachomim that we saw in the source at the bottom of Omid Aleph. Being that Rabbi Chia is simply ruling like the Chachomim that you need to have both, the Gemara asks, Shlita, is it not obvious? Yachid v'rabim halachik v'rabim. When you have a controversy between an individual and a majority, the halacha will follow the rabbin, the multitude. The multitude opinion is weightier than the individual opinion. So the Gemara reveals to us that man chachomim, the opinion that was quoted on Omid Aleph as the opinion of the chachomim that requires both, is really an individual. Rabbi Yossi, it's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, Desanya, and we have a Tanaic source in which Rabbi Yossi will appear. Harei shebo v'omar malti v'lo tavalti. Imagine a person that we knew to be he had been a Gentile, and he comes and tells us that I circumcised, but I didn't immerse. Matbilin oisoi umabakach divrei Rabbi Yehuda. We will immerse him without checking through witnesses if his milah, his claimed circumcision, was a circumcision with mitzvah intent. We don't worry about that. According to Rabbi Yehuda, immersion is enough. Rabbi Yossi oimer ein matbilin. Rabbi Yossi says no. We have to verify that the circumcision was done with proper mitzvah intention. Rabbi Yossi requires both. And the fact that he's physically circumcised is not enough. He might be an Arab that also practices circumcision, and circumcision that's done without mitzvah intent is of no value. So Rabbi Yossi, unlike Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi is concerned that the circumcision was done properly, and only then would we allow an immersion. Lefikach madbilin ger b'Shabbos divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rashi at where the star appears that we've written in Lefikach hayol ula Rabbi Yehuda b'chadas sakya. Since according to Rabbi Yehuda one is enough. Madbilin b'Shabbos ger shemol esmol lefaneinu. Now we have to emphasize, if the convert had circumcised in front of us, meaning we are aware that it was done with proper intention, that allow him to immerse himself on Shabbos. The b'milo sagile, the circumcision really was enough. He didn't need to have immersion. His immersion on Shabbos, even though Shabbos is a time that we do not engage in changing the status of things, in repairing things, in fixing things. You see the term misakni gavra, to fix the person. That means to enable him to assume a different status, i.e. a Jewish status. But the immersion is not of significance according to Rabbi Yehuda once we know that the circumcision was done with proper intent. So hence the source says, Lefikach, we'll read that line again in the source, in the Gemara, Lefikach, since only one is enough, Matbilin ger b'Shabbos di Rabbi Yehuda, a ger that had circumcised himself in our presence with our knowledge, done with proper mitzvah intention, on Friday, the day before Shabbos, we can have him immerse on Shabbos because that immersion really is of no consequence. And as a result, it wouldn't be a problem of misakin gavra. For Rabbi Yossi Omer, ein mapilin. Rabbi Yossi says that even under those circumstances, we cannot allow him to immerse on Shabbos because you need to have both elements, the circumcision and the immersion, so that even though he might have circumcised himself in front of us from before Shabbos, the tevilah, if it were done on Shabbos, would be the concluding act necessary for his conversion. And Shabbos is a time that we avoid doing things that are of a fixing or completing nature. So we brought this source in to demonstrate that Rabbi Yossi is the opinion that says you need to have both things, and it's not the opinion of the multitude, even though it was referred to on Omid Aleph at the bottom as the Shlita of the Chachamim. It's really the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. So it was important for us to hear that Rabbi Chia bar Abba, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, rules like that. Omar Mor, Lefikach Madbilin Ger B'Shabbos Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. This is, of course, a quote from the source we just saw, where it says Pshita. Is that not obvious? Kevan Domer Rabbi Yehuda B'Chado Sugya. Since Rabbi Yehuda says one is enough, Hecha Demol Lefanenu Madbilin, where he had circumcised himself in our presence before Shabbos. That's enough to establish the Jewish status. Why should there be any problem in his being toivel on Shabbos? It's not Misakni Gavra. My Lefikach. What is the necessity of the source to spell out that point? That once the Mila was done in front of us, that he's able to be toivel on Shabbos. Why not? Mahu detema. Without this having been spelled out, I would have thought the Rabbi Yehuda Tevila Iker, that the mainstay of conversion is the immersion. Utvila b'Shabbos lo the Kamasakin Gavra, and that Tevila on Shabbos cannot be allowed because that would be the improvement or the completion of the individual as a Jew. Komash Malon Rabbi Yehuda oiha boy. What the source is informing us is that as far as Rabbi Yehuda is concerned, it's either or. It's not as if the immersion is the main element. Again, a quote from the source above, Rabbi Yossi Omer ein makbilin. Rabbi Yossi says that you do not immerse a convert even though he circumcised himself already before Shabbos. You don't have him immerse on Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Yossi, as we explained before, requires both circumcision and immersion. Being that we understand Rabbi Yossi to require both, this point that Rabbi Yossi says you're not makbil on Shabbos, pshita, that's obvious. Came on the Omer Rabbi Yossi tarti boinon. Since Rabbi Yossi says we need to have both tikune gavra b'Shabbos lo mesakninon, to complete a person to complete the conversion requirements on Shabbos, we would not do. The Gemara has to answer then why is it necessary for the Tanaic source to spell out Rav Yossi's position of Ein Matbilin when that would seem to be obvious? The Gemara answers, Mahu de Tema, the Rav Yossi, Mila Iker. I might have thought that as far as Rav Yossi is concerned, the mainstay of conversion is the circumcision. V'hasamhu delo havoy mila b'fanenu. And where is it that Rav Yossi is insistent on the tefillah? That's where the milah, the circumcision, was not done in our presence. But where milah was done in our presence, and we're aware of its effectiveness, of its accuracy, being that it was done with the proper intent, I would have thought that there's nothing wrong with this kind of person being toivel on Shabbos, being that the mainstay is the milah, and that if it were done in front of us, that would have been enough. Komash Malon Rav Yossi Tarti Boy. So the point of this source is to say that that's not the way to look at things as far as Rav Yossi is concerned, that the milah is the mainstay, but rather both practices, both are necessary. The circumcision in front of us, as well as the immersion of tevilah in the mikvah. Omar Rabba Uvdo Hava Bei Rabbi Chiva Rebbe V'Rav Yosef Masni. We're going to have in the next few lines what I'd like to call a build-up of names. Rabba says a Maisa took place in the home of Reb Chia, the son of Rebbe, and Rav Yosef adds to the names of this incident, Rav Yossi Masni, Reb Oshaya Rebbe, meaning in addition to Reb Chia bar Rebbe, Reb Oshaya Rebbe was also there. Rav Safra Masni, an additional level, an added name, Reb Oshaya bar Chia, that this third gentleman was there. So there's an incident involving these three rabbis, the Osulit Kamei, Ger Shemo V'lo Toval. There came to them a convert that experienced circumcision but not immersion. Omrulei, they said to him, Shohi Kan Ad L'Mochar, wait here. Now this story took place at night, so they said, wait here till the next day, V'nit Balinoch, and then we will immerse you. Shma Mino Plus, from this story, particularly from Rav Safra's version of the story, that there were three rabbis, we conclude 3 points. Number one, Shma Mino Ger Tzorach Shlosha. In order for Gerus to be effective, you have to have it done in the presence of three. Ushma Mino Eino Ger Ad Shimo Virpo. And we learn from this story that he's not considered a ger until the immersion is done, in addition to the circumcision. Because as we saw before, this story involves someone who had already been circumcised. That wasn't enough. They insisted that he wait till the Tvilah. Ushma Mino, and we also learn Ein Matbilin Ger B'Layla, that immersion does not take place at night. The Gemara asks, V'neimo Shma Mino Nami Bo'inon Mumchin. Why not include a fourth conclusion from this story, that you have to have three experts, like in this story you had three great rabbis present, and that in general all gerus would require mumchin, experts. The Gemara says you can't conclude that from this story. Dilma de iklu. It might be that they just happened to show up at the time that this convert was presenting his case, but not that you need to assemble three experts from the outset. The Rashi says, Dilma de iklu hachi hava maisa de isramu rabbanon kihani. That the incident was just that it so happened that three great rabbis assembled. Aval shlosha, vaday shaminon. But as far as the need for three, that, as we pointed out in number 1, the Shma Mino Geret Tzorach Shlosha, that you see from here. Midikapolig Rav Safra Moisif Adahavu Tosa, from the fact that Rav Safra insisted on presenting his version of having a third person there. Omar Rav Chia, we continue in the Gemara. Omar Rav Chia bar Abba, Omar Rav Yochanan, Ger Tzorach Shlosha. a ger, in order for conversion to take place, you need to have 3. Mishpat ksiv bei. The word mishpat, which generally speaking means judgment, appears in the context of conversion. And Rashi quotes the Pasuk Mishpat ksiv bei, Mishpat echad yeh lochem v'lager. So that you see that mishpat, which is judgment, and judgment cannot take place with less than 3, is pertinent for gerus, for conversion. Before we continue the Gemara, there is a topic heading that we have on the side, the nosei, ne'emonus lomar ger ani, the believability that can be assigned, or possibly not, to someone that comes along, and based on Tosfos we want to add someone that we knew had been a Gentile, and he comes along and he tells us, I am a converter, I have converted. The Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, Mi Shebal V'Omar Ger Ani. Someone who comes and tells us, I have been converted to Judaism. Yachol Nikablenu, can we accept him? Talmud Lomar Itcha. Now we have a pasuk that the Gemara is citing on the side. Let's look at the pasuk that we've written on the side. Pasuk from Vayikra Perek Yutes Pasuk Lamed Gimel. V'chi yogur itcha ger ba'artzachem lo sonu oso. So in the pasuk it says itcha b'muchzak loch. Who is considered a ger? Someone who was known to have that status. Someone who was known to have converted. By the mere announcement that he makes, I have converted, that's not enough. Ba v'edov imoi minayin. If a ger comes together with witnesses that can testify to that effect, from where do we know that that is to be believed? Talmud Lomar v'chi yogur. The Rashi adds to this, Talmud Lomar v'chi yogur mikomokum, means if there dwell amongst you, however he might be. So that comes to include a case like this. Now, this particular point needs clarification, because once you have witnesses, we know that according to Torah law, witnesses they represent the final word in basically all matters. So, is it not obvious if you have 2 witnesses that come and testify about a person's having converted that is to be believed? Do I need a special reference in the pasuk for that? Again, that will be dealt with later. The pasuk says, "Ba'artzachem." We continue at the top of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. Ein li ela baretz. From this, I would think that conversion can take place only in the land of Israel. The chutzlaros minayim. From where do we know also outside the land of Israel? Talmud Lomar itcha b'chol mokoim she'itcha. Now, it's also noteworthy, and the Gemara will pick up on this later, that this very word was already explained in a different context. We said b'muchzak loch. So, how is the same word used for a different drasha? The Gemara continues, in Cain, if you darshan itcha to mean b'chol mokom shitcha, wherever you are, in Cain matam lomer ba'aretz. Why does the Torah limit things to the land of Israel? The pasuk said, what's the purpose of limiting to the land when in fact it's inclusive of even outside the land? The Gemara answers, Talmud Lomar, or I should say, let's read that line again. Im kein ma Talmud Lomar ba'aretz. Answer, ba'aretz sorach lahavi raya. In the land of Israel, proof must be brought to the conversion. The chutzlaretz ein tzorach lahavi raya. Outside the land of Israel, no need to bring proof. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and we look at Rashi at the top. Tzorach lahavi raya sheba based in his gayer. He has to bring a raya, bring proof that he converted in a court. Shemo givoni mohu, who he might be just the fact that he is circumcised, he might be a givoni. A givoni are people that latched onto the Jewish people but are themselves not Jewish. And why would someone want to do this? Umishim shvocha deretz Yisrael hu dekol marhachi u'mashaker. He's saying that I've converted without proof. A person might claim he's converted so as to benefit from the benefits of the land of Israel. The land of Israel in the Torah is described as the land flowing with milk and honey. So that it might be because he wants to benefit from the benefits of the land of Israel that he's claiming that he has converted when in fact he has not. So in the land of Israel, Rav Yehuda says we need to have proof that he converted in the presence of a basin, of a court of three. The Gemara continues, whether in the land of Israel or outside the land of Israel, proof must be brought that he had converted in the presence of a basin. The Gemara now raises the question that we pointed out earlier, Ba hu v'edov imoi, case where a convert comes with witnesses. Kra lamali, what do I need a posuk for? By the way, the star Mem Vav Amud Beis indicates where you can find this by looking for the star on Mem Vav Amud Beis where this quote came from. So the question remains, why do I need a posuk to tell me something that is so obvious that one is believed when he has witnesses? Rav Sheshes explains what really taken place as far as the source is concerned. The Amri, the witnesses said, Shamanu Shinisgayer the Bezdin Shel Ploni. They are testifying that we heard he had converted in so-and-so court. It's not as if the witnesses are saying we saw him go through conversion in the presence of a specific court, but rather it's more of a, we'll say, hearsay. We heard that. So, I would have thought maybe not to believe them. Chamash Malon, the Gzeres HaKosuv here is telling us that the Gzeres HaKosuv of Achi Yogur is telling us that if you have this level of testimony, that you can believe them. We continue again with a quote, the Artsechem, quote from the source that began at the bottom of Mem Vav Amud Beis. The pasuk said, "Ba'artzachem ein li elabaretz b'chutzlaretz minayin." From where do we know that conversion takes place also outside the land of Israel? Talmud lomar itcha b'chol mokom she'itcha. The Gemara asks, "V'ha afikte." Did we not already darshan the word itcha? In other words, we see second line from the top over here. Itcha is coming to include wherever Jews may dwell. However, at the bottom line of Mem Vav Amud Beis, we saw the word Itcha to explain why a person who simply comes and claims that he's a ger, we don't believe him, because you need b'muchsak loch. So how can the word Itcha be used, recycled if you will, or used a second time? Once you say that a particular Torah word teaches me X, you can't come along and say it teaches me Y. The Gemara answers, Chada me'itcha, v'chada me'itchem. There's a pasuk that we have quoted, we've written on the side of the Gemara. This is based on the Gra commentary. Vayikra Perek Yutes pasuk lamed dalid. Pasuk says, "Ezrach miken yeh lochem hager hagar itchem v'yahavto lo yikamoicha ki ger miyisem beretz Mitzrayim ani Hashem Elokeichem." The emphasis, though, you can see, is the word itchem in this pasuk, which makes reference to gerim. So we have two sources: one to tell me b'muchsak loch, and the other to tell me even outside the land of Israel. This we saw at the end of this. Is again a quote from the source above, that wherever you are, even outside the land of Israel, proof must be brought that you converted in front of a proper court. The Gemara asks, but did we not see a limitation to the land of Israel? The source had darshaned this above. On the third line from the top, we saw Rav Yehuda say, and that's what I had learned from the word, well, since we upgraded the reading from the word itchem. So why do the Chachamim say that even outside the land of Israel you need to bring proof? So just to go over that point, did the pasuk not specify ba'artzachem, that in the land of Israel you have a different standard? So the Gemara answers, Hahu miboyale, the ba'artzachem is needed for something else. It's to tell me that afilu ba'oretz mekablim gerim. It's to tell me that even in the land of Israel we will accept converts. That is what ba'artzachem tells me. It doesn't limit the need to bring proof to the land of Israel, but rather it tells me this point, this novel point, that even in the land of Israel we are willing to accept converts. The Salka Daita Chamina Mishum Tivusa Eretz Yisrael Kamagairi. You might have thought that people who claim to be converts are doing so only to benefit from the benefits of the land of Israel. And V'hashtonami Delekativusa. And nowadays, when it's not a land flowing with milk and honey anymore, we're talking about a period likely after the destruction of the temple, but still there are benefits to be accepted as a Jew and be a part of the land of Israel. Ikol leket shikol peo maiseroni. There's still different tithes that the poor can benefit from. The names of the tithes are leket, shikol peo, and maiseroni. So one might have thought that a person who is claiming to have converted is doing so, or a person who expresses an interest in conversion is only doing so with this ulterior motive for his own personal aggrandizement and benefit. Kamash malon. That's why the word ba'artzachem appears to tell me that we don't suspect that, and we accept gerim even in the land of Israel, assuming that their interest in conversion is for altruistic purposes as opposed to these ulterior motives. Amr B'chil Bar Abba, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, halacha bein ba'aretz bein b'chutzar tzorch lahavi raya. So Rabbi Yochanan rules like the Shlita of the Chachamim, that whether it's in the land of Israel or outside the land of Israel, the convert who claims he converted has to bring proof that he did so in a proper fashion in front of a court of three. Pshita is Rav Yochanan's ruling not obvious. Yochid v'rabim halachik harabim. You have a controversy between an individual and a multitude. In this case, we had Rav Yehuda on the one hand and the Chachamim on the other. Of course, the halacha will follow the rabbim, the multitude. What does Rav Yochanan add to our knowledge that we wouldn't have been able to conclude on our own? Mahu detemo, without Rav Yochanan, I would have thought mistaber taima de Rabbi Yehuda to come Messiah lekroi, that the reasoning behind Rabbi Yehuda was stronger, because the simple reading of the pasuk would have appeared to be in his direction. He at Rabbi Yehuda had darshan ba'artzachem, meaning that only in the land of Israel do you need to bring proof. And isn't that the more, we'll say, simpler approach to things? So that's what I would have thought, to go like him, because he has the power of the pasuk behind him. Kamash Malan, Rabbi Yochanan says that even so, we will rule like the Rabbanan, like the Chachamim, requiring proof, not only in the land of Israel, but also outside, conversions outside the land of Israel. Before we conclude, let us remind you that if you wish to be in touch with us, especially in order to access marked Gemaras, we can be reached at gmarkings@gmail.com. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.